Justin Schieber of Reasonable Doubts, and this is a video response to the November 26, 2012 podcast episode of Stand to Reason. So, on November 19, Greg Koukl tweeted, he said, in response to God's judgment of the hideously nasty Canaanites, sometimes I think we have to simply let God be God and leave it at that, no apologies. And then I, through the Reasonable Doubts Twitter, replied with, let God be God. Well, is there any action of God that couldn't be defended with that approach? Eventually I found out that Greg did offer a response to my reply on his podcast. And so in this video I want to raise some concerns and perhaps highlight some inconsistencies I felt were evident in this episode. So, starting at the 9-minute mark of the November 26th episode, he says, no, there is no action of God's that cannot be defended by that. Now think about what this means, though. It means that God can literally do anything logically possible, and regardless of how morally counterintuitive it is, we are simply in no position to say that God was unjustified in doing that thing. Greg wants us to think that while commanding the death of men, women, and children may seem like an obviously evil act, it's actually the case that we just lack the full knowledge required to actually be confident in saying that it really was an evil act. So, according to Koukl, perhaps there are some greater goods that God is aiming towards, but in order to achieve them, he must command these Canaanite killings, right? So there's a greater aim in mind. Or perhaps there are greater evils that God is trying to avoid, and so in order to avoid them, he needs to command these killings. Now, of course, the assumption here is that these greater goods or greater evils are things that we don't have epistemic access to, right? So we're in the dark about their existence. We don't know that they exist. Now, this, of course, was my point. My concern here is this: if we can't say that God is unjustified in commanding the killing of men, women, and children simply because of the lack of our knowledge, if we can't say that that's unjustified simply because of the lack of our knowledge of some possible greater goods or evils, then we can't say that God would be unjustified if he were to torture, rape, or lie to us. We're simply in no position to say that God is unjustified in doing any of these things. So that's really what this kind of position would have to hold to. Let's say that Greg Koukl came across a part of the Bible that he actually hadn't seen before. I know that's very unlikely, but it's within the realm of possibility, so let's entertain that. And he comes across this page that he hadn't seen before, and it reads, "And then the Lord moved over his people and savagely raped the women and tortured the children of the towns." Are we to think that Greg Koukl would shrug this off and say, let God be God? Of course not. I'm sure Koukl's a decent guy. He just hasn't fully thought through the consequences of this view. In Koukl's view, with God, all things are permissible. So he goes on to say, quote, "To let God be God means that he's operating within his appropriate sphere of authority, and he is operating consistent with his nature. But I'm afraid this can only really be seen as empty rhetoric because of what we've just heard. Greg has just established that there isn't such a thing as an inappropriate sphere of authority for God. Every possible action of God's, however morally counterintuitive it is to us ignorant mortals, just is within the appropriate authority sphere." For Koukl, the phrase appropriate sphere of authority simply has no meaningful content to it. Now, what about the second part, where he says God operates consistent with his nature? So essentially this is just saying that God only does what God's character would lead to. Notice, though, that this says absolutely nothing about the kinds of things that God would actually do or wouldn't do. It gives us no information about this. And for that reason, I don't think it's very helpful in answering any questions here. It might be that God's character is consistent with raping or with lying. Perhaps this is part of his repertoire, his moral action repertoire that we remain ignorant of. Of course, we couldn't appeal to Titus 1:2 without begging the question, because this could be a divine revelatory lie. So for Koukl, the phrase operating consistent with his nature also has no real meaningful content to it. Moving on. Koukl continues, he says, part of letting God be God is an acknowledgement that God owns everything. It all belongs to him in virtue of having created it, and he has appropriate control over everything. Essentially, he's the boss. I'm simply going to point out that I just don't see the inference here from the fact that God created all of it, and therefore owns it, that to the claim that therefore he can treat everything however he wants. This is wildly counterintuitive. If we were ever to create sentient robots, nobody in their right mind would think that we should be able to treat them however we want, torture them, or order them to kill each other. Does Koukl not agree with Spider-Man that with great power comes great responsibility? Koukl puts a lot of emphasis on our very common basic moral intuitions. But what is more intuitive than this basic moral principle? He goes on. He says, quote, "This is not just an appeal to power. We also know that part of the character of God is that he is good and that he is just." But, of course, as we've seen, these are just empty words. Again, if God is good, and if there are no limits to the actions of God that he can be justified in doing simply by saying, letting God be God, then nothing interesting has been said here. If God commands killing, killing is good. If God commands rape, rape is good. If God does any of those things, those things are good, at least to God. They're at least permissible to God. So Koukl wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to say that our very basic moral intuitions are grounded in God. But as we've seen, that's not the case. He wants to say that theism alone can make sense of our prized moral intuitions, but by doing so, he completely abandons some of the most obvious moral intuitions that we have. He needs to realize that he can't have it both ways. Again, in Koukl's view, with God, all things are permissible. Lastly, he unsurprisingly turns the tables on atheists, right? And he asks, what basis do we have for condemning these kinds of events, these killings and such? Notice, though, that this entirely misses the point. He has yet to have a coherent position of his own, and that's what I'm pressing here. I say we handle one issue at a time. All that being said, I do appreciate his taking the time to discuss the issue. And if he's watching, which I hope he is, I appreciate his time. Thank you.